Childhood and risk. A good starting point for understanding this topic is to reflect upon the experiences that you had as a child. What sort of things did you used to get up to? And think about, perhaps, if you have children, the kinds of things that you now allow your children to get up to. Would you allow them, for example, to do the same sort of things that you did as a child? And what are the reasons for that? Since the 1980s, Ulrich Beck has argued that in a postmodern society, we've become increasingly preoccupied with risk. In his book, The Risk Society from 1992, Beck outlines the features of this obsession with risk. Risks to health, risks to safety, risks to the environment, and hence we seek to establish circumstances of zero risk, and with it a sense of predictability about outcomes. So in this obsession with risk, we believe that we can completely minimise all risks and make our lives completely risk-free and predictable. But really, how realistic is this? Frank Furedi adds to this risk discourse in proposing that society is now engulfed in a culture of fear, and that's the title of his book from 1997, and that this fear serves hegemonic and control purposes. You might want to look into that term hegemonic. What does it mean with reference to social control? How do these concepts such as blame, fear, no win, no fear, rational choice, troubled families, neoliberalism, how do these concepts and constant signage control us socially? So what are we going to do with all this risk and uncertainty? Well, one of the ways that we've tried to control it is to rationalise it, to break it down and try and make sense of it. And as Beck and Furedi claim, this is actually an impossibility, the quest to try and rid our lives of risk. And we might say that this is a process of rationalisation and thinking around the subject, but that might be a can of worms. This very, very complex slide gives you some sort of sense of what we're the point I'm trying to get across when we're saying we're trying to rationalise risk and harm. And if we can somehow come up with an equation, we can somehow quantify and make predictions about the probability of risks in the same sort of way that we can make conclusions about probability in mathematical equations. But the social world is not governed by the same principles as pure mathematics. Nevertheless, it doesn't stop us from trying. One response to the problem of risk has been the development of a range of risk assessment tools, some of which aim to incorporate a predictive element. So say Brown and Saki, 2002. But given that human beings are poor at gauging probabilities, Eileen Munro suggests that we should not expect child protection workers to be fortune tellers. And that's a citation from Daniel, 2010. But actually, when we're working with families, are we expecting those practitioners to be fortune tellers in some instances? When we talk about a risk factor, we mean something that makes an experience likely to damage the individual, or something which is statistically predictive of a poor outcome. So says Sarah Meadows. Before we continue, can you think of anything that we might think of as a risk factor? What do you think is a risk factor towards children? A risk factor towards a happy childhood? A risk factor towards a child attaining 5 GCSEs, for example? Or a risk factor that makes a child more likely to attend prison or become a drug user? One of the studies that influenced our modern understanding of what we mean by risk factors is the classic study of London Boys by West in 1982. And again, this is taken from Meadows. And West was looking at the criminal tendencies of young men in London around this time. And he identified 5 key risk factors as a predictor, and that's illustrated by the crystal ball here, as a predictor of future criminality. And those risk factors, according to West, are having below average intelligence, having a parent with a criminal record, coming from a low-income family, and having parents whom social workers considered to be inadequate parents, and also coming from a large-sized family. So all the co-occurrence of those 5 risk factors were strong predictors of whether or not a young male person was to become a criminal. So you might think about some of those in more detail. Are we saying that every child with a parent with a criminal record becomes a criminal? Or are we saying that that is a strong predictor of becoming a criminal? Subsequent research has identified other features of children's lives deemed to be risk factors, i.e. the Bernhardt et al. Study of 2002. Intervention into the privacy of family life is legitimated by legislation that is based upon the premise that children are vulnerable. Hence, we have a justification because of children's supposed inherent vulnerability and susceptibility to risk that the state has a right to intervene into private family life. And that we cannot take it for granted that parents will always offer the appropriate protection to their children. And certain rare but very public child tragedy profiles indicate this. And we might have to consider, as uncomfortable as this may be, that on occasion parents may actively harm their children. So with that possibility in mind, we can then deconstruct how parents or the environment that children grow up in constitute risk factors and may do them damage in the longer run. So in the source material here that I'm referring to, which is the Royal College of Paediatrics Child Protection Reader 2007, you can see the source there in the bottom left-hand corner. You can obtain this source by searching online. It's freely available. And these 3 types of risk factors are consistent with the Department of Health Assessment of Children in Need and Their Families 2000, and they form into 3 distinct categories: child factors, environmental factors, and parental factors. So what sort of factors that are inherent in children themselves will constitute a risk factor? Well, it's the child that is unwanted, the child that fails to meet parental expectations, children that were born at the wrong time, i.e. in the middle of a drug habit or a relationship breakup. The child is the result of unwanted sexual experience such as commercial prostitution, rape and forced sexual encounters. And sometimes that the child is considered to be the wrong gender. Now these kind of things might seem abhorrent to what a caring parent might think about children and childhood. However, these factors were identified as Brown and Herbert as contributing towards children's vulnerability. There are other physiological and psychological factors, such as that the child is premature or has illness and spends a long time in hospital, which affects the parent's ability to bond with such a child. The child has physical or learning disabilities. The child has behavioural problems or is seen to be difficult or challenging. And all those things can contribute towards a child's inherent risk factors. The second category are parental factors associated with risk, again from Brown and Herbert. So you've got these factors about being a parent that can contribute towards risk to children, and that is being a step-parent, being alcohol or drug dependent, parental indifference, intolerance or obnoxiousness towards children, the parents themselves were abused as a child, parents having antisocial personalities, parental mental health problems, parents suffering domestic violence, parents being teenage parents when they conceived and gave birth, multiple births, i.e. twins or a number of children in the family, disabled parents, single parent families, and this technical term Schedule 1 offenders or risks to children. And this is a list of individuals that have recorded offences against their name which were committed against children. Interestingly, a Schedule 1 offence can take the form of a let's say, paedophilia against a very young child, but also if a 19-year-old adult physically assaults, i.e. Punches a 16-year-old individual, a child. Those both go down as Schedule 1 offences. So it's not just enough to consider that because a person has a Schedule 1 offence against their name that they're necessarily a risk to children. We've got to delve deeper into what actually the meanings are behind that Schedule 1 offences, and it's worth remembering that that kind of caveat applies to all these different risk factors. So, for example, simply being a teenage parent doesn't necessarily mean that that parent is a risk to their children. But we might consider how multiple occurrences of these different risk factors can add up towards posing a risk to children's development. The third category are environmental factors, as identified by Gelles 1997. And we can think about the environment in which children live as contributing in a negative way towards their development, the risks. So we have to consider the place where they live, the housing conditions. Are they safe? Are they warm, for example? The wider neighbourhood in which they live. Who are the kind of people that live in that neighbourhood, and what sort of physical shape is the environment in? Also, within that environment, is there a history of family violence or dysfunctional family interaction? And that can be illustrated by studies that identify that parents that are violent towards pets and animals are much more likely to be violent towards each other and towards their children. So there's a correlation there. There are also strong correlations between growing up and living in poverty and living in socially isolated circumstances. According to Parton, cited in Daniel, the current child protection system evolved throughout the 1980s and 90s in the UK. Previously to this time, from around about the time of Kemp in the early 1960s, where child abuse was seen through the medical lens, a socio-medical model, we moved away from that diagnosis and therapeutic support for the child abusers and the abused towards a more bureaucratic socio-legal model, where there's an emphasis on the legal framework as provided by the Children Act 1989 and the various other swathes of policy that have come out since that time regarding child abuse, risk and family support. And hence the need to intervene into family life and taking a systematic and a forensic approach to the investigation of allegations of child abuse and neglect is framed very heavily in the law, policy and procedures, which are legal rather than medical. Of course, medical procedures still continue to contribute, but Parton's claiming here that there's a shift away from a medical diagnosis of child abuse to a more bureaucratic, procedural, framed in the law approach. According to John Pitts, who's cited in Armstrong 2006, there are political reasons for a concentration on the analysis, the risk factor perspective. There are political reasons for this, and these reasons are, in a time when politicians are unwilling to countenance robust social and economic intervention to counter social problems, and they are eager to demonstrate that they are tough on crime, an analysis which identifies poor child rearing practices and weak parental control as the fundamental problem, and a strategy which targets families and classroom regimes and their capacity to inculcate self-control in unruly and disruptive children is a political godsend. Now, what this means is that blame is shifted away from social problems such as living in poverty throughout one's life and inequality and unjust social policies that blame people we shift away from that or cover those problems up, those social problems up, and say that the reason why children fail and the reason why children are at risk is something to do with those children themselves or the way they have been individually parented. Hence, politicians therefore don't have to do anything about social inequality and poverty and things like this, but can rather say what we need to do is tackle the problems at an individual level, deal with troubled families rather than deal with a troubled society. Armstrong goes on to make the point that the current UK government policy on young people and problem behaviour is heavily focused around notions of risk, the need for early intervention and prevention. Some policies are aimed at the reduction of problem behaviour and future crime, and others, such as Sure Start, are aimed more generally at providing children and families with the support that will enhance their future life chances and opportunities. So when we're promoting the life chances of children, either at the young offender stage or potential young offender stage, or with a very young child attending a Sure Start nursery, the aim is that these protective factors of intervening and having positive experiences in these settings will countenance some of the risk factors they experience from their parents and in the environment. A more recent phenomenon is the redefining and broadening of child protection to become generalised under the umbrella of unmet need. So what we have here is an expansion of the concepts of children's needs. No longer does the state need to intervene when children are at crisis point at the child protection stage. We need to see need as existing along a continuum. So some children have very low level needs, which we need to intervene with, and some children have very high level needs, where we have a more severe or robust form of intervention. The Hardacre model, for example, supports this idea. Nigel Parton, in analysing New Labour's children's policies, includes the shift in language from referring to child protection to the modern phenomena as referring to it as safeguarding. And then hence that's a shift, a broadening of responsibility away from keeping children safe, child protection, protecting children, to safeguarding all children. So we make a shift towards unmet need, which is an increasingly wide range of adversities that it's considered that the state should be concerned about. And I think it's worth making note here at this point that we're talking about the pre-financial crisis state of affairs, 2008, 2009, and into the current state of affairs in 2015 with welfare cuts taking place. So Parton's making the point that in the New Labour period from 1997 to about 2007, that 10-year period, there was an expansion in policy and an expansion in the perspective that the welfare state should take a more active role in the lives of all children. And now we can see a reduction in services to children and families as a result of the cuts, and that is now being rejigged and and the ideology about it is being reconstructed to say that actually we should leave parents alone in the main to look after their children, and the state should only get involved with an increasingly smaller number of families with children with a high level of need. Troubled families is one example of such a policy and initiative. So the search for risk factors which can be identified as precursors for future problem behaviour is well established, but it's problematic in the tradition of medical epidemiology, which is the study of the causation of disease, but also in terms of the study of criminology. Quite simply, if we can identify risk factors such as smoking, which contribute towards cancer, or we can identify such things as parental drug misuse, which contribute towards children's propensity to offend. If we did something about that parental behaviour or do something about the smoking, we can counter the effect later on. We can reduce cancer, we can reduce children's offending and so on. But the picture or the reality is not quite as clear as that quite mechanistic model would have us assume. The expansion of research and child welfare policy is inextricably linked with the view that children are inherently vulnerable, in fact more vulnerable, that seem to be more vulnerable than ever. And the anecdotal theory around this is that we currently, in modern times, wrap children in cotton wool. We try to prevent their exposure to any kind of risk. And that's couched in the belief that normal human development requires considerable investment in time and effort by older humans. We'd kind of accept that, but it's worth thinking back to, say, the 1950s or even the 1970s, whereby what did we expect children of, or young people of 15, 16 and 17 years of age to be doing? In terms of what ages did they leave school and what ages did they start work, providing for their children, take the responsibilities of being an adult and so on, and have children. So if we consider that children, basically families constituted at a much younger age, and young people entered the workforce at a much younger age and were relatively successful around that, we might compare that now to the modern phenomena that many young people continue living and being dependent on their parents way up into their late 20s. And there's kind of an inherent belief that up until that point, children and young people, well, rather young people and young adults are not able or in a position to take responsibility and stand on their own 2 feet. Well, what's all that about? So in conclusion, children are generally considered to be more at risk than adults based on notions of their inherent vulnerability. It's worth thinking about this idea of inherent. What can we see as actual vulnerability, and how much of that vulnerability is socially constructed? Advocates of the social constructionist approach to childhood contest that this vulnerability perspective, that it minimises children's agency. In other words, it reduces what we think children and young people are able to do, and consequently we make them much more dependent on adults and other systems for a much more longer period of time. Quite simply, we don't trust children and young people to make reasonable and rational decisions. Policy and practice development has been influenced over the past 20 years by an actuarial, that means counting in an accountancy type sense, and a rationalistic, the socio-legal model approach to attempting to control and minimise risk. It's proposed that the identification of multiple and compounding risk factors can predict future enduring problems in later life, such as the West study. Although research regarding risk factors and outcomes might inform accurate assessment and interventions into families with unmet needs or that pose risks to children, on the other hand, this approach may be considered political, placing blame and responsibility upon parents rather than assisting and paradoxically interfering unnecessarily into the lives of children may actually put them at further risk and reduce their life chances. So this is a question to think about as we end. What is the relationship between risks and taking risks? What's the relationship between risks and prevention? And what's the relationship between taking risks and building resilience?